And that's now hitting every part of the region. The impact of this on South Asia's poor will be much more as we see it go, because the impact of the global recession is what? We're seeing protectionism even in countries like the US, which is now looking to move their manufacturing back home. We saw the closing of borders during COVID, which is now continuing, and more and more of a resistance, if you like, to immigrants and people coming in. The rupturing of supply chains, countries saying, I will not necessarily continue with my supplies just in order to take care of my own populations. And the third big crisis, I think, and we've heard so much about it this week, comes from the climate change crisis. I think the Pakistan floods we saw this year, the worst in decades, were just the latest reminder of the kind of dire peril this region lives in. And why do I say that? I don't think most people understand just how much parts of South Asia are vulnerable. When it comes to the vulnerability index, actually South Asia is in the bottom 10% of the world. 20 of 23 cyclones or large cyclone disasters in the past have occurred just in the Bay of Bengal region. Global warming, coastal degradation, soil salinity, water scarcities, all things we're dealing with on a daily basis. And they cause not only the deaths of thousands in South Asia, but I think if we go with this business as usual approach, as they call to emissions, BAU, we will see that by 2050, and these are World Bank figures, nearly 63 million climate migrants will be created in South Asia. So on the backs of all of this doom and disaster that I've just spelt out comes the Ukraine crisis. Interestingly, South Asia's reaction to the war in Ukraine has been strangely unified. If you look at the United Nations, for example, at the UNGA votes, we have seen vote upon vote where most of the countries in South Asia, if not all, on some of them, have abstained. They want to stay out of whatever is the outcome of this. If you look at their statements, the statements are always about dialogue and diplomacy. It's interesting that South Asia in particular, where dialogue and diplomacy is not really the way people are finding out of their current conflicts. But South Asia's response to the Ukraine crisis has been very much that we must find a way to talk. And the worries that each of us have articulated on food, fuel, fertilizer security in the wake of both the war and then sanctions by the US and the European Union. So these are all commonalities in our approach to the war in Ukraine. But where exactly is South Asia going to be hit the hardest? And, I'm afraid that we don't really think about these in, as I said, a South Asian context. We tend to think of them as how's my country going to be affected. But more and more, first, energy security. As fuel prices soar, the US has, of course, shut down its exports. Europe is diversifying to renewable energies, also much more to the Middle East, West Asian oil resources in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. South Asia will either be starved of these resources over time or they will become extremely expensive. Obviously, for the moment, most countries are looking to those Russian exports. They have not fallen in line with the Western sanctions on them. You take a look at India, for example. Since February till today, India has increased its intake of Russian oil 21 times. So if we did 44,000 barrels or so in February or before February, today we do about 960,000 barrels of Russian oil. Russia is India's #1 source for this month of oil. It's a quarter of India's imports. Pakistan and Sri Lanka have done more or less the same. We understand until the Russian foreign minister actually called off his visit to Dhaka later this week, he was expected to come and speak about Bangladesh too, taking in Russian oil. But we all know that this is going to come to an end if the sanctions tighten. The second place where we've seen that physical impact is on food and fertilizer prices. They have gone up. Food inflation is rising across our countries. Increased insecurity in Europe is going to be a problem for us. If there is more of the war clouds gathering over Europe, our students, our immigrants, our workers are going to be affected more and more as the war goes on. The second big impact, and again, I don't think we think about this. Remember, 140 countries in the UNGA actually voted to criticize Russia's actions in Ukraine. But when it came to the sanctions by the West, only 40 countries are part of that, or less than 40 countries are part of those sanctions. What does this mean? It means that there's 160 countries out there that are seeking to bifurcate, perhaps, what the economic systems are going to mean. Over time, and of course, both in Bangladesh and in India, we have seen the impact of very, targeted sanctions by the United States in the last year. In Bangladesh, it was over the Magnitsky Act. In India, it has been over importers of Iranian oil, Iran also under sanctions. More and more discussions in the region are about payment mechanisms being separated. So you might have national currencies being used more and more, as a result of which we could see what is being called, and I think it's a bit premature right now, but the de-dollarization of the global economy. This is going to be something South Asia is going to have to deal with. And finally, there will be a weakening of WTO mechanisms as a result of what we are seeing as the impact of the war in Ukraine. The third big challenge, and I think every South Asian country already feels it, Bangladesh is seeing it a little, Sri Lanka sees it, Nepal is seeing it, that our region, where we should have the largest vote, is increasingly becoming a place of US-China contestation. There is a competition, but it is an unhealthy competition because it seeks to cut out the other entirely from projects. We're seeing a greater securitization, if you like, military pacts with one side or the other, more exercises, military exercises, and more divisions over this particular contestation. I think South Asia needs to think very closely about allowing this contestation to take over what should be our voice in our region. And finally, the fourth point here, I think, is that we are likely to see an end of multilateral forums, an end of globalization, and possibly an end of the United Nations. I know this sounds extremely dire, particularly at a time when, if you go to international conferences, actually people are talking much more about multilateralism. But what we are seeing instead is a fragmented world. It will become much more about might is right. It will become about the fact that the United Nations was first helpless when it came to COVID, helpless when it came to helping the countries worst hit, and helpless in holding the country where it originated from much more to account. Another thing that's going away is globalization. It is becoming a bad word. If you look around you, countries are seeing globalization as one of the reasons why COVID was such a problem. They are seeing the supply chains that were globalized as another big problem. Where is this going to lead? Obviously, each of us is not going to be one economy for themselves. It's leading to more and more focus on regionalization. What are the regional groupings that are already doing very well? I don't need to tell you. There's the European Union. In South America, there's Mercosur. The US, even in its most protectionist times, has been able to work through the USMCA with Mexico and China. The Gulf has its own. Eurasia has its own. RCEP has all the countries, 15 countries to the east of us, in one economic cooperation pact. Where does that leave an area like South Asia? SAARC has obviously failed us. The South Asian Preferential Trade Agreement does not seem to hold much water. SAFTA, Free Trade Agreement. When it comes to transit, we don't have that either. BIMSTEC has not yet made any ground, not covered ground on trade as much. And BBIN, while it has led to, say, a Bangladesh-Bhutan trade agreement or a Nepal and Bangladesh trade agreement, is still mired in the same problems. The Motor Vehicle Acts, for example, does not extend even to the 4 BBIN countries. So I would just like to end this by saying, our part of the world, South Asia, is today making a lot less sense than it ever did before. While the logic of South Asia, one geographical unit bounded by the Himalayas and other mountains to the north, bounded by the oceans to the south, that geographical logic remains, actually politically we have very little logic at work. The fact that we allow bilateral differences between states, whether it is India and Pakistan, whether it is Bangladesh and Myanmar to the east, we allow those differences to hold up regionalization, that we still don't have transit trade through the region. And remember, this is actually going backwards, because we did in the past, in the old times, have transit trade through the region. Old trades are disused. There are students go elsewhere to study. There are tourists go elsewhere to travel, and many of our patients go elsewhere to seek medical help. There are supply chains lead outside our region when there are so many resources and the need for markets within South Asia. Intra-regional trade, less than 5%, I think, this year, while others, those other regional groupings I mentioned, have 55% of their trade within their own region, that we don't have a common platform. And we saw this at COP27 as well, that we don't have a common platform on climate change and reparations, we don't have a common platform on healthcare, on labor rights, and remittances, which every South Asian country knows the value of. These are all reasons why I say we're making less and less sense in South Asia when you look at the global landscape, particularly after Ukraine. This morning, the former president of Serbia, Mr. Tadic, said, states are behaving more and more like humans. I would only add to that, in South Asia, we are at present behaving like humans that put their petty differences above and their rivalries over really what their head and their heart should tell them. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So our next session is Democracy X.0, Mandate of the Mass. And for this session, I would like to request on the stage Ms. Dana L. Olds, Chief of Party, Democracy International, Bangladesh. Rani Yan Yan, Advisor, Chakma Circle and Indigenous Peoples Human Rights Defender, Bangladesh. Kaji Faisal bin Shiraj, Country Representative, the Asia Foundation, Bangladesh. Jovan Ratkovic, former Foreign Policy Advisor to the President of Serbia. Mr. Nurul Kobir, Editor, New Age, Bangladesh. Ms. Jaina Jallad, Lawyer and Human Rights Scholar, Palestine, and she will be acting as a moderator. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I think the previous intervention has really set the frame for this one and set the tone, and I'd like to start where Suhaini has ended, by how states behave as humans. And this is where, like in today's world, where we have, it's undeniable globally, the state of human rights and the state of global governance, state of democracy has been facing a retraction. In today's world where democracy has been marked by political turmoil, political instability, fragile economies, weakened democracies, and ongoing political instabilities, conflict, consequences of climate change, complex human situation, as well as difficulties in implementing sustainable development goals. In today's world, marked by all these characteristics, where are we standing as human subjects? What are our agency as individuals or as our collective? What kind of programs or what kind of work can we do towards the realization of a human's potential? I would like in this panel to have more of a candid, more of informal conversations where we get our perspectives on current issues based on our experiences and open after the floor for participations and questions. I'd like to ask my first panelist, Dana, based on your experience and your really vast experience, whether in Asia or globally, what do you think is happening now amid this landscape that might seem like a bleak picture, but I still believe, despite this what sounds like a bleak picture, hope is still there. Does it feel like there is a broken social contract? What could we do? What are your general thoughts, if you may, please?
So thank you. First, thank you to CGS for organizing this very relevant, timely, and extremely interesting conversation. I really enjoyed the session so far, and I'm pleased to present. Again, my name is Dana Olds, and I'm the Chief of Party for Democracy International's Strengthening Political Landscape project funded by USAID. So, our project, Strengthening Political Landscape, we work with political parties in Bangladesh, the major three parties, around internal democracy and as well fostering intra-party tolerance, so tolerance between the parties. So I wanted to sort of take a higher level look at governance in the region, democracy in the region, and give some perspectives, as you mentioned, while definitely beleaguered, I think democracy is definitely not defeated, not around the world, and certainly not in South Asia. As a matter of fact, the South Asia region makes up 60% of the world's democratic participation. So an extremely important region when we talk about democracy and the progress on that. But of course, even as our last speaker mentioned, some of the challenges of COVID, we really, of course, saw as well democratic backsliding during COVID. There was already some backsliding before COVID occurred, and this kind of exacerbated things to an extent, right? In terms of rising authoritarianism in the region. So if we're thinking about anything from, of course, the military coup in Myanmar to recent turmoil, even in Sri Lanka or Thailand, we're definitely seeing the divides. We're seeing how people are divided. And some of the powers that were taken on by certain governments during COVID, and some of those powers that still remain vested with them. And I was reading, of course, over the notes for this session, and one of the questions was, or thoughts was, has democracy even really taken root in this region? But I would say that the challenges notwithstanding, we can all agree that, there are certain places where democracy is definitely well-rooted in the region. If you think, looking at India, there are literally artifacts showing electoral democracy thousands of years back in the sub-region and the subcontinent, in India in particular. And since independence, of course, India has continued on with regular elections, and then as well you can look at Sri Lanka, right? We think about India, but as well Sri Lanka is really the oldest democracy in the region. Universal suffrage came to Sri Lanka way back in 1931. So, there is this sort of spirit of democracy in the region. But, while democracy is more than elections, I did want to touch a bit on the importance of elections in my chat. Because really, electoral democracy is central to maintaining and growing democracy around the world, and I think that we should, address that important topic. South Asia is definitely has a mixed record when it comes to, implementing elections, and there are definitely challenges faced with electoral democracy in the region. At the same time, you see in certain countries, for example, in Bangladesh and Bhutan, there's actually been a rise in the last national elections anyway in voter turnout. So there's a huge enthusiasm in the region when it comes to elections and participation on the part of citizens. That said, the region is also plagued by, issues of perceptions of electoral integrity. So, really citizens questioning that electoral integrity, and the electorate becoming increasingly apathetic. So while interested to go out to the elections, less interest on the part of particularly youth and women in terms of participating in politics. And of course, fundamental to this, you mentioned the social contract, in a sense that's really the question that we need to be pondering right now. Where are we with the social contract between citizens and authorities in South Asia, and how can we strengthen and build that contract? Fundamental to a democracy and elections is this concept of representation that reflects the will of the people and represents all groups and societies, but we know that that's a daunting task, not just in South Asia, around the world, right? But we're talking, of course, about South Asia this afternoon. A healthy electoral process is built on, there's sort of three fundamental pillars. It's the legislative piece, right? So is there a legislative legal framework that sets the groundwork for participatory elections? Do you have an independent electoral management body? And on the back end, do you have sufficient measures to put in place election dispute resolution? But beyond that, so this is just sort of the overall framework. What I want to focus on here is this concept of women, youth, and how do we bring a democracy that really represents the will of the people. And I want to focus on two things: proportional representation and leveling the playing field for campaign finance among the important issues to be considered to improve electoral governance. Why am I talking about proportional representation? Actually, in South Asia, there's a mix, right? When you say proportional representation, generally there's the sort of first past the post. So, right, a simple majority means you win a seat. But where does that leave women, minorities, other disadvantaged groups, often disenfranchised and left out of the process? But in South Asia, there's actually a mix, and even in Bangladesh, there's a mix, right? They have 50 seats set aside for women as reserved parliamentarians, right? So that's a sort of a mixed system. There is some proportional representation there, while the majority of their seats are first past the post. I think that we really need to look critically at what's happening in the sub-region, and there are countries such as Nepal that are really making strides in this area. For example, in Nepal, they have 110 of their parliamentary seats are actually proportionally attributed, right? So in that way, you have 9 different political parties that are actually represented in their government. So that's a great way to sort of bring about diversity, and I think we need to think more seriously about how to bring other voices into the diversity of political parties as well as groups, and that's a way.
Thank you, Dana. This is I'll come back to you, but this is a very good account of how there are some positive examples and lessons that could be learned from around the region where women participation, enhancing meaningful participation that goes beyond just the quota system, or where there is more effective, meaningful participation, which leads me to Faisal. I have a question for you, so I'm changing a bit the order here. So Dana has talked about and raised the question whether democracy has really existed in the region here, and what does it mean to have a meaningful democracy. If I look to places where, for example, where I come from in the Arab region, the meaning of democracy doesn't necessarily exactly mean the universality of democracy or the prerequisites of democracy in other nations. And social mobilization, for example, the pursuit for social, legal and economic equitable change has been repressed in the Arab region in the wake of the Arab Spring, as everyone have witnessed. It brought, if anything, more of an iron fist that handcuffs not only those who are pursuing justice and democracy, but also threaten those who might think in the future of what could be a way to strategically mobilize for change. Amid that landscape, what are your thoughts on the question of democracy, and whether this is like a very broad question, but what are your thoughts based on your experience, especially in Asia, on democracy, and what are the prerequisites, if we may ask?
So I think I will start by being a bit more vague and then being a bit more straightforward.
Being a bit more vague means answering
more
more the vague
level,
question that I asked, right?
More at the philosophical level, and then come down to earth. So there is a saying that only the paranoid survive, and the way sometimes we also pursue our world is that there's an end coming, whether it's democracy, whether it's climate change. And it's very important to also take into account the long-term trajectory of things. And with the human civilization coming this far, I am an optimist who thinks that the world is eventually going to be a better place, but with some short-term pains, whether it's authoritarianism, whether it's freedom of speech being curtailed, whether it's about persecution. I think eventually in the short-term process, these are going to be shorter and shorter, but within the human civilization and history, this might at some point turn to be insignificant. But however, I don't underestimate the short-term pain points, short-term suffering of the people, and that's when I think leadership plays a huge role. If we are talking about democracy and if the philosophical underpinning of leadership is not based on democracy, then we do have a serious problem. I'm not saying that they should read all Plato or Aristotle. They need not necessarily debate on who is right in saying that human beings are fundamentally wronged or human beings are fundamentally correct. But the fact is, depending on how you see people, how you see the world, how you experience, these things matter in your democratic leadership philosophical foundations. And at the same time, I might be really outrageous to say that we should also read Machiavelli, where he said, if I have to choose between fear and love, I will always choose fear. So I am not encouraging that, but what I'm saying is that maybe there is a time when we need to openly discuss about this serious fundamental philosophical underpinning of our individual leadership and take it into a country level, take it into the national level, take it into the global level, understanding there is a diversified thought process, there is a diversified leadership process, and there's a need to be greater tolerance, and that, I think, is the foundation of democracy. Now, coming to my own country, I think it must be addressed that Bangladesh has seen significant economic improvement in the past decades or even more than that. And that is important. That is very, very, that needs to be apprehended. But at the same time, we should not be bringing economic versus democracy debate as such. It's not like one overrides the other one to be prosperous. Even when we talk about economy, I think the economy needs to be resilient. And when we talk about resiliency during the COVID and during various other natural calamity in Bangladesh, we have seen the economy can be resilient. But the question is whether it's going to be sustainably resilient or not. And when we talk about sustainable resilience, there's again, I believe personally that issue like democracy comes in, issues like freedom of speech comes in, issues like tolerance comes in, and you need to be able to bring in diverse perspective into a governance, into your accountability system, into your transparency system to make sure that your economy is sustainable. So it's not one or other. I believe that they both need to happen, and they both need to happen concurrently for a sustainable development of Bangladesh. So,
thank you, Faisal. And this leads me to my next question to Rani. Rani, Faisal ended his answer that became not very vague, but rather narrow on the issue of resilience. For you, as someone who works as a human rights defender, who works also with indigenous and minority groups, my question is, amid this terrain and then this landscape where your rights, obligations, duties, the question of governance are very intersecting and interlinked. How in your work do you think, and based on your experience, voices, needs, and priorities of minorities and those who are at the margin of the society could be reflected in any revisit, if we want, of a social contract, or if we want of an agenda of democratic governance? Like how the needs, desires, and priorities of vulnerable minority groups could be reflected in a broader democratic project?
Okay, greetings and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you. Before I answer your question, I think I need to address what's been written on this agenda, that we have set the current political landscape of the South Asian region, where populist leaders and autocratic governments are in rife. And the leaders, and thanks to the leaders and governments who have been instrumental in dividing the cultural divide, increasing the cultural divide that we have seen in past decades, I would have to say, because they would need to be in the power, and they would need to think about how to be in that power. And the best way to get into power and hold on to power is to use people's sentiments. And I'm talking about all the governments in this region. And in expense of who? Most of the time, in expense of minority people, in particular, marginalized people who usually are not visible in the political landscape because they are so minute in the size, population size, compared to the rest of the countries, and who may try to raise their voice, but most of the times their voices are not being heard because different instruments are in play to put their voices down. We also see that governments in this region, if all of you have not noticed it yet, the laws and regulations that are adopted by one political party to carve out resistance of the opposition political party will be utilized against that party intentionally and brutally once that ruling party becomes opposition party. And I think that's one of the core characteristics of South Asian political governance culture, I would have to say, is that resentment, is to take revenge, rather than ensuring good governance, since we are talking about democracy and democratic culture within South Asian region. So every political party is aware of that consequence, that what's going to happen to them once they become the opposition party, if they lose the election and become the opposition party. And that is why we see that when one political party comes into power, any ruling political party that comes into power, they will try its best to disenfranchise the opposition party, or in some cases, they will try to obliterate the opposition party so that they won't be facing those consequences that, at first place they have put up in place. They try to do it in one term, and if it is not possible within a term, they will rely practically on rigged elections so that they can hold on to power until they can get the majority's approval of what they're doing. But in any case, since I'm here to speak about minorities, especially indigenous peoples and marginalized communities, I really need to ask that question, where indigenous peoples and marginalized communities are located or situated in this political landscape, where all the majority people are scrambling for power and power politics. Where are we situated? And also, since I've got this opportunity, I would like to remember and commend all indigenous peoples and marginalized peoples activists who have been struggling so far to raise their voice and becoming visible in this practically invisible platform anywhere in this world. So indigenous peoples, also I would like to give some solutions, how we can make equitable distribution of power, democratic power.
1 minute.
In 1 minute?
The solution.
It might be a bit difficult in 1 minute, but I'll try. Okay, so indigenous peoples always had this governance system way before this modern democratic governance systems came into place, way before the modern nations were built. It is based on their customs, it's based on their living experiences. And some governance structures are institutionalized, and some governance structures have lost its way because of so many myriad difficulties they have faced. And forcing assimilation of indigenous peoples have never produced any positive results in any country in this world. I'm not even talking about South Asia, I'm talking about in the world. It never worked. So rather finding a way to integrate different governance system into the modern governance system, it works, though not without challenges. There are many challenges, but we can work with them. So in India, we see that there are autonomous states. In Bangladesh even, we have semi-autonomous state for Chittagong Hill Tracts, where I come from, where formal governance system work alongside our indigenous, traditional, customary system. And Chittagong Hill Tracts Regulation of 1900, it ensures that this semi-autonomous status stays so that every people in Bangladesh has equitable share of power. But unfortunately, there are some efforts that's been done where this CHT regulation that ensures indigenous people's participation in the governance system is being curbed. And CHT Accord, a peace treaty that's been signed between the ruling party and indigenous people's political party 25 years ago, that has not been fully implemented. But this accord holds major provisions, if implemented, would resolve some of the conflict issues that we have in our region, but more importantly, it would ensure equitable democratic power to indigenous peoples and this other citizenry of this country. And the hope of seeing it fully implemented is quite fading away rapidly. So the point I'm really trying to make is that even those governments in this region, in this sub-Asian region, that already have the instruments in place to provide democratic power to marginalized people in an equitable manner, not always have the goodwill to apply that. So at the end of the day, it brings down to what the government thinks, how the power politics plays in for them to be in that power, since what we think is that democracy is majoritarian rule, what the majority
Thank you,
people
Rani.
think.
Thank you. Did you want to say one last sentence? No. Can we can come back during questions. I know this is an issue that requires much more time, but to give an equal opportunity for our fellow speakers. Nurul, so Dana has talked about the 3 pillars for democracy, whether laws, legislations, executive power. Journalism could be a 4th pillar for democracy. Based on your work and your direct interactions and writing and coverage and your vast experience in the field of journalism, how do you see having a candid journalism that really captures the nuances and experiences of people with the intersecting facets of their identities could be a tool to promote for a more democratic governance? How journalism could serve as a medium that would enable, instead of being a disabler or a filtering, censoring mechanism that would suppress or silence people. If you could share with us your thoughts on this.
It's okay? Can you hear me? Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, Chair. Well, if journalism is about providing public information to the public and critical analysis to them, and thus empowering people to ensure participation in power, then in the context of South Asia, I think I should begin with the politics of exclusion, aggression of neoliberal economy, and the challenges of journalism, something like that. Well, in Dhaka, I am very infamous of being critical of power. So, and I have reasons to be critical of power because power is a dangerous thing, it's an evil necessity. So before I enter the challenges of journalism, we need to see the state of affairs, political and economic, in South Asia. Well, charity begins at home, so I start with Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a nation state with 2 nations. One is Bengali and another is Bangladeshi. So Bengali nationalism excludes non-Bengali identities and people, as my previous speaker has highlighted some of those. Bangladeshi nationalism, which has boiled down to Muslim nationalism, excludes non-Muslims. So that's a paradox how Bangladesh is a nation state at all. Second is politically, I came to know here in this afternoon that our ministers, some of those were invited and they consented to come to here and deliver speeches. None of them appeared. So I inquired with, some of my reporter colleagues are here, I inquired with my reporters what happened. Then I came to know that they have decided last night that they will not come here, although they promised to come. And CGS people adjusted their programs, schedules. So I was thinking, why they don't come? That's a private sector, one of the biggest conversation program, international seminar. Bangladesh should take pride in it, in the South Asian context, and the government should have felt them. The answer is, perhaps. They can't stand critical questions. They can't stand queries from people. Why? As to why? Say in South Asia, forget about the, beyond that, we the citizens of this country have to be told by others what is a midnight election means. So we had 2 elections that people here couldn't vote. So we are here in Dhaka and beyond Dhaka fighting for an 18th century demand, that's restoration of voting rights. Those who have snatched our voting rights cannot stand people face to face. They love to deliver monologue. So this is Bangladesh. So we have poor people excluded. We have, by one definition of nationalism, non-Bengalis are excluded. And by another definition of nationalism, non-Muslims are excluded. And we have the rich and poor divide. The poor people are excluded. This is Bangladesh at the moment. If we look at India, our most important neighbor, there is electoral democracy there, but the BJP's Hindutva politics has excluded all the other non-Hindu citizens and identities. If we look at, say, Sri Lanka, they have not yet been able to decide whether it will be a Sinhalese state or it will be a non-Sinhalese state, inclusive state. Nepal, yesterday there was a general elections after they made their constitution. A few years ago, they became a republic, but political horse trading, factional feuds, and difference of opinion between the central and provincial areas they have not been able to settle, and the poor people are the victims of that. In Afghanistan, we can see every day, particularly the women are excluded. So, and in other South Asian countries, things are not that different. So Maldives, even the participation of women in politics is less than 1%. So we in South Asia, living in a situation where exclusion is the fundamental features of politics and economy. So under such a system, to come back to the job of journalism, of course exposing them, finding out what are the reasons, and questioning them, questioning the authorities. The authorities in South Asia understand pretty well that the journalists will be doing this and intellectuals will be doing this, so there are a lot of laws. We call it a rule of journalism. The whole legal regime of journalism here is a rule of repressive laws. So, to be precise, the job of the journalism is to defy the state laws, those who are the lawmakers, not elected properly, and create consciousness among the people that Bangladesh or any other countries in South Asia or beyond that doesn't deserve this. So it's not about being a little tactical, it's about challenging the authority with adequate information and critical analysis. Some of us are trying to do that, of course. There are a lot of problems. And I know I have some friends in South Asian countries, except one or two among journalists. They are trying their best, but it's a really, really challenging job. We would seek help from all of you to stand by us, because if journalism fails, it's not the loss of journalists alone. It's the loss of the whole society, because without a free flow of public information, public cannot be informed properly, and without being properly informed, they cannot make right choices in terms of politics or economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very candid perspective. I'd like to move to my friend Johan, who served as the former foreign policy advisor to the president of Serbia. Johan, after hearing the perspectives of all the fellow speakers on pressing issues that are directly at the heart of challenging democracies or the futility of the logic of law, or why democracy is not functioning to its best. There are feelings among of what has been shared of those subjects or those subjects who are feeling a sense of anxiety, abandonment, or the logic of democracy as it exists is not working the way it should be. Being the only non-South Asian speaker, myself I'm not, but as a speaker, being the only non-Asian, South Asian speaker on this panel, and based on your experience, how do you see and how do you perceive the role that outside actors or stakeholders could play in contributing to the strengthening of democracy, the enhancement of the rule of law, or the advancement of better governance in a way that really fits the needs and priorities of the people who are at the center of it? So how could contribution be made in a way that is really compatible with what those are in need for?
Thank you, Zaina. First of all, it's my great pleasure to be in Bangladesh for the first time. Of course, since the Second World War, there were several attempts all over the world to promote democracy. Some of them were successful, some of them were not. Some of them were even forcible ones by supporting coup d'etats in various countries and supporting armed rebels. But as a mankind, we have enough experience to be able to draw some conclusions and some parallels from these decades of experience of trying to promote democracy in different regions of the world. So I will have 6 brief points that I would like to share with you. My first point is that democracy can be supported from outside, but it cannot be imposed from outside. It cannot be simply manufactured somewhere and then exported. It doesn't work like that. Sustainable democracy has to be locally sourced. My second point is that regional settings, regional context, and regional knowledge is very important for promotion of democracy. If we are talking about a country that is in the region where there is strong democratic neighbor or neighbors next door, that would of course eventually help development of democracy in that particular country. And that regional knowledge should be used very much. My third point, good neighbors and other outside actors can support democracy in a certain country by offering economic ties, but by offering technical assistance, and even by offering constructive political pressure to support internal reformers in that particular country. My fourth point, by strengthening economic ties through trade, through investment, through foreign aid, it is very important to focus on strengthening and building middle class in that particular country. Because once democracy emerges, it was proven that countries with robust middle class are much better equipped to sustain it. Very often, outside actors are focusing on helping country in question simply to promote overall growth, economic growth and wealth. And very often, the gains of that promotion end up in hands only of elites. And most of people in a country in question do not really get to benefit from that growth end that well. My fifth question: it is equally important, if not more, to support civil society and civil society organization in a country in question, especially grassroots movements, and also independent media. And above all, it is important to support the ones that are peaceful and non-violent ones. Promoting armed rebels, even encouraging coups d'etats that we saw in the past being done by some of major powers, never really produced sustainable democracy. It merely switched from one dictatorship to another one. So it is very important that those movements are peaceful and non-violent ones. And my sixth and my last point: unlike all of these positive measures, negative measures like introduction of economic and other sanctions proved not to help promotion of democracy in long term. Thank you very much.
Johan, thank you so much for this very straightforward answer, which makes me think of the work of Edward Said on Orientalism, and then his work on out of place. And how can we look at the plight of democracy today in a way that we're not out of place, but there are shrinking spaces, and how can we use our will and our power as human subjects, as civil society actors, as people with certain voices and powers to address these shrinking spaces and address any dysfunctionalities in systems. I think really 40 minutes is never enough to mention any, to go deeper, just barely scratching the surface with my distinguished speakers on this panel. I was hoping we'd have the opportunity to ask a couple of questions, but I think we're just running out of time at this point. So we're not only out of place, out of space, but out of time. So I thank you all for your very valuable perspectives. And please join me in thanking this panel and our distinguished speakers on their takes and perspectives. Thank you so much. Is Zolar here?
I would like to request our speakers to stand up in front of their seat so we can take the official photo. Okay. Thank you.
আমি চিনি।
Next, we will have two speed talks, and for the first speed talks, I would like to request Dr. Aliria Sir, Distinguished Professor, Illinois State University, USA, and the topic is Bangladesh-India relations, too close for comfort. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Center for Governance Studies for arranging such a wonderful occasion to be together and discuss some of the important topics. It is a pleasure and honor to be here, and I am indebted and grateful to Zelur Rahman for giving this opportunity. To remain true to the title of this session, Speed Talks, what I'm going to do is make some remarks which evidently require some explanation, but the time would not allow me to go. However, I would like to have this opportunity to have this conversation beginning. I think these remarks will give this an opportunity for us to talk in the coming days, if not coming months. My title is about Bangladesh-India relationship, too close for comfort. Usually, Bangladesh-India relationship is seen through three prisms. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to question these three prisms, but I would like to raise some questions which might be going against the grain of conventional wisdom. So what are these three prisms that usually Bangladesh-India relationship are seen through? The first one is the geography, history, and culture. The second one is the economic and environmental issues. And the third one is political. And when I say political, it is the domestic politics of both countries as well as the regional one. So among these three perspectives, in the geographical one, often Bangladesh is reminded that it is surrounded by India, which is a geographical reality, so to speak. And Talukdar Manuzzaman once said that it is the tyranny of geography that engulfed Bangladesh, which is true in the sense if you look at it. But this is a mindset as well, which I think is absolutely wrong. Because Bangladesh has an opening which is called Bay of Bengal, and that is why we are here. Increasingly gaining importance of the Asia-Pacific and practically the Asia-Pacific region, which is becoming the center of economy of the world. Bangladesh should define its role not by being surrounded by India, but looking at the Bay of Bengal and looking east towards the Asia-Pacific. And that is why when we speak of the geography of Bangladesh, we should start, and I would request that let us start, that we have a door opening that takes us to the Asia-Pacific, and that is the center where we should remain connected to. So when we speak of the history, we are told that the connection between South Asia is so intense, so immense, and so deep that we cannot be separated. Yes, it is true, but it is not at the same time. Because let us not forget that 47 did come and 1971 did produce. In 1947, Cabinet Mission did propose a somewhat a loose confederation of South Asia. And it is the Indian National Congress and Mr. Nehru who denied, and he said that he's not going to accept it. That led to the division of 1947's establishment of Pakistan. Right? So can we forget that one? That is the mindset of a Delhi-centric idea of a centralized state that has created India. And I don't think India has come out of that. In similar vein, let us not forget that the Bangladesh could have been in 1947 an independent Bengal. There was a proposal on the table. And in the Bengal Legislative Assembly, those who came from the West Bengal voted to decide to have a Bengal that is part of India. But we did establish an independent Bengal, if not in 1947, in 1971, with blood and tears. So that is the history. The history cannot be simply based on that. We are also reminded that the history, in terms of history, we are told that, it is a very close connection, right? But then again, let us look at the history. The history tells us that Delhi has always been the center of power, and Bengal never actually cowed down to the Delhi's dictate. There were 12 rulers in Bengal when the Mughals were ruling from Delhi. Right? And in similar fashion, when the British ruler faced resistance in Bengal, when did it start? In 1760 through 1856. And that is the time when the resistance came from Bengal. We talk about the cultural affinity between India and Bangladesh. Yes, there are cultural affinity with West Bengal. What kind of cultural affinity are we talking about northern India and Bengal, Bangladesh? As I said, I'm making these brief remarks because those may sound provocative, but that is what I want to do. The cultural affinity between Bangladesh and West Bengal is definitely we share culture. But West Bengal is not India in the sense that it decides the policies of India towards Bangladesh. It is decided by Delhi, and it is in North India, and I don't think Bangladeshi culture has any whatsoever relationship with that. So with this, we come to 1971. Of course, the enormous help that came from India had been pivotal in creating the Bangladesh. But it is the Bangladeshis who fought and established it. We remain deeply gratified. We have a deep gratitude to India, but at the same time, gratitude is often the worst cross to bear. So with this, if we are talking about this history, culture, and the geography, there is a need to revisit and sometimes maybe questioning the conventional wisdom. We are talking about the second point is the economy and the environment. 54 rivers are shared. Bangladesh has been established 50 years ago. Yet there has been only one treaty of sharing the river. We talk about connectivity, absolutely necessary, absolutely necessary. Yet, however, the largest country in this region, sharing 54 rivers, have never been able to decide what kind of sharing and connectivity needs to be. Only one. And for the last 4 years, we have been hearing about another treaty, which would eventually, maybe in a day, someday, we might get actually. So, when we are talking about the environment, can we actually separate environmental issues without talking about these river resources and distribution of water? Can we? I don't think it can be. Bangladesh is being, look at the part of Bangladesh. Desertification is the major problem. We talk about the climate change. Yes, sea level rise is an issue, but why not talk about the desertification, which is precisely a political decision. Precisely a political decision. We're talking about the economy, right? And we have been hearing about economy of sub-regional cooperation. If you recall, in 1980s, the World Bank and other international bodies have been continuously insisting on the sub-regional cooperation, which would include northeastern India. What happened to that? Bangladesh has given transit, which would take goods from one part of India to the northeast. Why that was not being considered as a sub-regional cooperation between northeast India and Bangladesh? Connectivity is not only building roads that would take a truck from one part of India to another part of India over Bangladesh and simply be remaining, that is called connectivity. In terms of economy, $15.68 billion of trade have been taking place. Out of that, what? Bangladesh imported 13.70 billion. Only $1.9 billion of export to India. Non-tariff barrier seems to be a major problem in this case. How are we going to address that one if we are talking about economic integration? The final point is with respect to politics, the domestic politics. India has remained an issue in Bangladeshi domestic politics for a long time. Even since 1947, if you recall, the Pakistanis would actually, any kind of demands for autonomy and legitimate right was, countered with this campaign, the propaganda by the Pakistanis. Oh, it is an Indian conspiracy. Post-1971, we have heard that kind of thing. Anti-Indian card has been played in elections and all those things. Understood, understandable. But at the same time, it is true that since 2008, India plays a pivotal role in the domestic politics of Bangladesh. Perhaps a simple visit of former Foreign Secretary Sujata Singh should not be forgotten, how it has influenced the Bangladesh's trajectory of the domestic governance. In similar vein, if you look at the situation in the sub-region, in the region cooperation, and most importantly, with respect to the current situation whether Bangladesh would become the battleground between China and India, or for that matter, China and the United States, some of the issues that we are going to talk tomorrow. What is the role of India in this case? How does India actually view South Asia? Can we actually not think about it, considering an Indian kind of Monroe Doctrine, considering South Asia as the backyard of India? Will that be able to help having a better relationship? By putting egg on one basket since 2009 that we have witnessed, it is a very close relationship. But is it comfortable? That is the question I want to leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that wonderful speech. Our next speed talk would be by Mark Saxer, Head of Asia Regional Project, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Germany. The topic is geopolitical tensions, geoeconomic disruptions, the economy of tomorrow in the Asia Pacific.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, let me thank the Center for Governance Studies for inviting me. This is also the first time that I'm in Bangladesh, but actually I was invited already in February 2020 to this conference, and it's such a great coincidence that we finally can meet here and talk. It's called Bay of Bengal Conversations, and I want to let you in a little bit on the kind of conversations that I have in this region beyond the Bay of Bengal on geopolitics as well as in Europe. If we talk about geopolitics between Europeans and Asians, it is actually quite interesting to see that we agree, at least on the surface of it, on a lot of things. We don't want binaries. We don't want bipolarity. We don't want to decouple. We don't want to take sides. And we don't want conflict. So everything seems good. We all agree we want a rule-based multilateral order, and we all want to cooperate to a certain degree. The question that I have is, will it be possible to avoid choosing sides when the elephants are dancing? And there are, of course, two scenarios where this avoidance of choosing sides will be extremely difficult. Number one is the cataclysm of a hot war between the United States and China. And number two is more of a creeping, slippery slope of technological bifurcation, trade, block building, and economic decoupling. And I want to have a deeper look into these two trends. First of all, the first one by looking, and that's why I brought you this presentation, at the geopolitical theater of Eurasia or the Indo-Pacific. I think it's for us important to understand the motivation between the geostrategic moves of China as well as the United States. We do see on the right a line that has been there since 1945, since MacArthur marched towards Japan. That is the first and second island chain of the United States. This is basically a doctrine which will not allow any power to enter the Western Pacific, threaten Hawaii, or threaten even the west coast of the United States. This very line, however, threatens Beijing. They feel encircled, and they feel that there are too many choke points, especially at the Strait of Malacca, that can actually cut them off their resources and trade supply routes. So what you can observe what China has been doing over the last couple of years is, number one, to gain strategic space towards the West, breathing space, so to say, from any decoupling move with the target of the European market. And number two, area denial, access denial in the South China Sea, and a try to push through the island chain and gain access to the Western Pacific. I haven't said the word Taiwan yet, because I don't think the topic is Taiwan. The topic is precisely this geopolitical confrontation, and the locus where this could come to a head is the Strait of Taiwan, and this is why we have to watch that. I would like to also bring to your attention two important dates. 2024 is the next presidential election in the US. 2027 is when both the Chinese High Command as well as the Pentagon believe that there is going to be military parity between the US and China and the South China Sea. So this is not very far from now, and I think we have to watch that. Unfortunately, we cannot conclude today that there is not going to be a military showdown between the two. However, the eternal optimist that I am, I will now basically continue saying this will not going to happen. We're going to have some sort of a deal, and we're going to in a systemic rivalry / strategic competition without a military showdown. Still, I think there are two important trends that we will see accelerating or becoming more pronounced. One of them is the regionalization of the global economy. The second one is the erosion of the rules of the game or the world order. We have been seeing this actually for some time, that after the financial crisis 2008, both global trade as well as capital investment, export have not really been recovering to the levels of before. So we have been seeing actually a certain stagnation of globalization, or you can call, we have seen peak globalization in the rear mirror. That was before COVID. COVID drove home the point that those efficiency, just-in-time supply chains that we have created around the world are too vulnerable to disruptions, and we're going to see now a paradigm shift towards resilience or just in case. We're going to see an acceleration of exercises that I learned that if you build a car in Germany, you need 40,000 parts from almost every country of the world. So that makes you extremely vulnerable. And I think nearshoring, reshoring are some of the trends that I think will accelerate, and you will see another push towards digital automation in order to bring some industries home into the markets. On top of that is now the hegemony conflict between the United States and China, which is going to pressure Asian economies as well as European economies to decouple, to diversify, to friendshore, and maybe we see the emergence of trade blocs. Why does it matter? And why does it matter in particular for countries in this region? Well, you're going to see a large-scale reorganization of supply chains, which is already underway. And there is a danger to be cut out of these supply chains, and that is an impediment to economic development. You will see the increasing politicization of market access, something that is already happening in the Chinese market, and there is a good chance it will happen in other markets as well. And you will see the weaponization of tech, energy, and finance. So basically, I'm saying if we're going into some sort of a cool or Cold War confrontation between the United States and China, this new Cold War will be decidedly different from the old one. There is a possibility of war, of course, but the actual theater of war will be technology and economy and not so much the battlefield. The second trend, because I'm coming close to the end of my time, is the erosions of the rule of the game. So if this is now all happening, and you add to that what happened during the Corona crisis as well as the Ukraine war, that the multilateral institutions that we have were seen to not deliver to what they were supposed to deliver. And you have not only the great power rivalry between US and China, but you also have other regional great powers adding to the same tune, India, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia. The idea is that there is no longer a clear order out there that actually sets boundaries to behavior, but basically national interest or whatever is perceived as such is the compass for such postures. And of course you have the war in Ukraine, which effectively destroyed the European security order. So what we are seeing is the end of the unipolar moment after 1990. What we see is the end of this concentration of power. What we do not see, what we do not know, is what comes next. The question that is basically to be asked is, will the order after 1990, that some like to call the liberal order, survive the end of the dominance of its guarantor? And there's basically another trend that we have to watch very closely, and that's the domestic polarization within the US. We saw that under the Trump presidency, the US was basically withdrawing from most multilateral organizations that it actually founded itself. And of course, the Biden administration returned to some of them, but we don't know what's going to happen after 2024. So is an order viable when its guarantor power is not standing behind it? I think is a very important question to ask. Again, why does it matter? Well, number one, because a world order, if you like it or not, provides rules of the game, provides rules of the road, which actually cuts transaction costs. It provides opportunities for trade. It will actually allow this highly complex system of supply chains that we've built around the world, which in its immense complexity needs enormous political stability. So if you do not have this kind of stability in the rules of the road, you cannot construct the world economy as we had in the last 30 years. Of course, we also have to look at the global challenges, global climate change, pandemics, all the things that we need to tackle together. In that particular moment where we need global governance the most, the institutions that are actually supposed to help us coming to solutions are not working properly. And there is the return, the potential return of hot conflict. So, to conclude, my time is up. I think we have to look very, very carefully what is happening in the field of geopolitics, because I think it will change the opportunity structures for development, and it will set the framework conditions for what kind of development is possible in this region. Thank you very much.
Our next session and last session for today is 100 Seconds to Midnight, Converging Crisis Across the World. And for the session, I would like to welcome to the stage Dr. Rashid Al Mahmoud Titumir, Chairman and Professor, Department of Development Studies, University of Dhaka, Dr. C. Christine Fair, Professor, Security Studies Program, Edmond A. Walls School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University, USA, Greg Simons, Associate Professor, Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies, Uppsala University, Sweden, Dr. Satoru Nagao, Non-Resident Fellow, Hudson Institute, USA, Mr. Anil Kumar Trigoniat, Distinguished Fellow, Vivekananda International Foundation and former Ambassador of India. And the moderator of the session will be Dr. Nancy Snow, Founder and Director, Global Persuasion Strategies, East Asia and USA. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you doing? We're going to continue in the theme of a lot of crisis in the world, and yet it's going to be a little different in that we're looking at converging crises. In that respect, all nations of the world really are interdependent. We have a global community, we have a global civic society, and what happens in Bangladesh impacts us in New York City, or what happens in Tokyo, Japan will impact what happens in terms of climate change, food insecurity, all those themes that we've been hearing throughout the day. So without further ado, we have a stellar group of people on the stage with me, and I'm going to be co-moderating with Dr. Titumir to my right, and he is also going to be the first speaker. And what I asked of each speaker is that you not really give a speech, but rather talk about these crises in convergence. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Titumir and then move to Dr. Fair from Georgetown University, Dr. Simons, who is coming here from Sweden, or perhaps Poland. I'm not sure where you are. You're always on the move. My friend who flew in with me yesterday from Japan, Dr. Satoru Nagao, who is a non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute. And last but not least, Dr. Trigu Nayat, who is a former ambassador of India. Very nice to meet everybody. I'm rather intimidated. So I'm going to now give up to 5 minutes, again, remarks, and begin with Dr. Titumir.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, CGS, for inviting us to this session. It's really wonderful to have your presence. So the premise you have heard from Nancy, does that really constitute the full picture of it? So I would rather argue that 3 issues would really tell us that the way we formulate the narrative may not convey the kind of message that we want to share. So these would, according to me, would focus on first the causation, second the data, and the third the way particularly the international community wants to understand the narrative. I think they might be in a trap. So having said that, so the first one, that as if that the external crisis hit a nation and halts its progress, or the reversal is correct. If you were to look at, particularly in South Asia, and as a student of economics, that I could understand, that the manifestation of the crisis, be it food crisis, climate crisis, financial crisis, or anything to do with, if you look at Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, what we see is basically the crisis in the political settlement that leads to that outcome. And I could go on to establish my reasoning. Rather, this international crisis allows them to hide behind or conceal behind the failure of their political system. So that's one thing, because the way it looks as if that there are not structural rigidities, there are not risk or vulnerabilities pre-COVID years, or during COVID, or with the ensuing of the Ukraine conflict. So one has to really look at, you look at the cases of Sri Lanka, look at the case of Pakistan, look at the, and the second thing which is really important, if you really look at their growth narrative, you would find, even if the data is questionable, that if there is a segment of a political settlement that tries to be accountable to its citizen, might have a acceleration of the positive points or the negative points. Say, if you are looking at Bangladesh data 1991 to 2005, what you see that obviously according to the government data, you see that the rate of declining in poverty is accelerating, while you see the opposite after post-2005. Or if you look at the employment figure, or if you look at the private sector investment to GDP, all those back it. And same is the case with Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's social development really was something enviable to the South Asian nations. But with the political settlement captured, and even in India, then that brings our second question. How are we producing data? If you remember, in case of India, if you really look at the employment figure, you have seen that National Statistical Agency's officer has to resign. And the Prime Minister's office kept back data for quite some time. So how do you really look at and build the narrative based on data that lacks huge amount of credibility? And same applies in many countries. So that's the how without really evidence, how can you build a narrative? And then it backs to the last point, which I would finish because I would not take more, I would try to complete it by 4 minutes, and I can come back to illustrate my points if time permits. If you really look at the donors community or development partners or international community, they come up with a narrative to show their parliament, look, our tax dollar is bringing dividend. And then you come up with an idea of miracle, of surprise. Then when these economies cannot withstand any external shock, then what would you say? Then you hide behind, it's a paradox, or you hide behind and you say that it's a deficit, democratic deficit. So it's in that conundrum where they are, and now they can't do anything. And same happens because even in their own countries, what is happening is a minoritarian ruling the majoritarian. Look at the case of USA. Huge efforts going on because there are two ways of really amending US Constitution. One by Congress and Senate, the other by the states. And if 2/3 of the state agrees, then minoritarian would be ruling and making amendment to the US constitutions. So same applies with India, where you could see how Indian Foreign Service externalizing the debates that the domestic are having, what has never been seen by any Foreign Service official to take on international space a debate that is contested. But Indian Foreign Minister did it in UN General Assembly. So what is really important, it is obviously, the narrative is that obviously these countries are really on a fault line. COVID has exposed it. So if we are to really make a kind of a pathway, then obviously these countries were full of risk and vulnerabilities. Then COVID has exposed the fault line, so it has created downward pressures. And if the political settlement cannot really make a headway, then obviously it would create crisis. So the narrative that you see in Financial Times, that you see in many places, is really flawed. And it is flawed because the Anglo-Saxon way of really looking at it is really problematic. And if you are saying, yes, our tax dollar is giving us dividend, then you end up in a situation where 30 years of progress are reversed. Look at the SDGs. So then what you say? You are in real problem, and that problem is biting them. So what we need to really look at is to be aspirational, allowing there is a public society that, because the state by definition is coercive. So how do you create an institution that puts accountability? And that has to be homegrown, and that is where I would stop.
Well, I'm going to now throw it to Dr. Fair, because we've gone well beyond converging crises to contested concepts about what kind of a crisis is this? So I welcome your input here into our dialogue.
I don't even know if it's working. Is it working? Okay. So, hi, I'm Chris Fair from Georgetown. So before I make my comments, I want to thank the organizers of the conference for letting me be here and also for not having this be a manel. I also want to say that as an American, I am very much in disagreement with many of the things that my ambassador said. I find it really problematic as an American that the ambassador will hector others about democratic rights when democratic freedoms in my own country are under attack, even as I sit here enjoying this conference, right? So with what I'm going to say in the next several minutes comes from a position of humility and an understanding that many of the things that I'm about to criticize the region for are things that my own country does. And I'm not a nationalist, I'm an analyst, so I'm just going to lay it out as I see it. I do see the Bay of Bengal as a crucible for a number of intersecting crises, whether we're talking about the trafficking of weapons, narcotics, human beings, climate change. Obviously, there's been a lot of mention of it, but curiously, one of the most important panels, which was about maintaining the health of our forests, was sparsely attended, and it was only given 10 minutes in the course of this conference. Food insecurity, and I'm going to raise the issue of gender again. Women bear disproportionately the costs of all of these crises. Only half of us have vaginas, but we give birth to all of you, including those of you who don't. And so to continually see our views not represented by having panel after panel festooned with men without a single woman, this is part of the security challenge. You want security? You have to include women. And that means you have to listen to us. And this doesn't happen by having organizations put together panel after panel festooned with men. So what you're hearing is a lot of frustration in my voice. Thank you. It's 2022. In any organization that's putting on panels with just men, they're not doing it justice to the topic that they claim to be addressing, and it's also bad science, because the way you get good answers is by bringing in a diversity of opinions and a diversity of views. And women experience these crises very different than men do, okay? So having said this, putting my analyst hat back on, as I look about the Bay of Bengal, virtually every single country that's a member or a partner of the Bay of Bengal. Of course, not every country is represented here. I haven't seen anyone from Myanmar or Thailand. What I see is a very frightening, disturbing set of commonalities. First of all, democracy is retrenching. Whether we're looking at India, whether we're looking at Bangladesh, obviously, Myanmar. Countries such as India that once claimed to be one of the oldest democracies, I'm sorry to say, is making serious retrenchments from democracy, just as my country is the oldest democracy. And what we see setting up around the Bay of Bengal and reaching down into Sri Lanka is a strange sort of electorally competitive, but nonetheless authoritarian state with the ascension of religious nationalists and the rule of majoritarians at the expense of the minorities. So whether you're looking at being Muslim or less so, but still important, in India, a Christian, or whether you are looking at being a Christian or a non-Muslim in Bangladesh, or a non-Buddhist in either Myanmar or Sri Lanka. The details differ, but the trends are very similar. So if we're going to talk about green governance, we actually have to have good governance. And the countries around the Bay of Bengal are not exactly converging on that. They are instead converging upon sort of ethno-nationalist / religious fascism that caters to the desires and demands of majorities who somehow have convinced themselves that their ways of life and culture are under threat. As an American, I'm living through this as well. Somehow white Americans have convinced themselves that they're the real victim of the American historical project. And of course, that's not true at all. And while these countries around the Bay of Bengal are retrenching to these peculiar forms of authoritarianism, we have a really significant set of problems within the Bay of Bengal. And you know, there's at least one country who stands to terribly benefit from the lack of good governance in this region, and that's China. China has made no secret that it wants to set up an alternative order based upon Chinese principles and Chinese values. And I think we've all seen the Chinese values and principles at play in places like Tibet and Xinjiang, right? China is very interested in taking advantage of this space to try to forge new sea lanes of control and communication that have nothing to do with financial arrangements, because many of the slots that they have set up are not actually economically viable. These are strategic. So I would like to make an appeal in the few minutes that I have that we really try to understand and even reverse the retrenching of democracy that we see not only in this region, but also in Europe. I'm kind of puzzled that the President of Serbia is I'm not sure, the chief guest of this conference. That itself is an interesting choice. But we have democracy retrenching all across the world. And so the Bay of Bengal is just, I would say, a subset of what is proving to be a global phenomenon. It also, I think, highlights the inviability or the inefficacy of these alphabet soups of acronyms that we've heard so much about this morning. But I would even say the United Nations itself. If you look at the composition of the United Nations, we have 2 members of the UN Security Council that are not interested in a global order, much less upholding it, and that is, of course, Russia and China. So we're sitting here in Bangladesh. In Dhaka, to our south, we have one of the largest humanitarian crises, which is also spawning other crises, such as a massive environmental destruction in Cox's Bazar, and I'm talking about the Rohingya. And we can't do anything about the Rohingya because the Chinese basically thwart any effort at the UN Security Council, and they are assisted by their co-vetoers, the Russians. And, you know, the United States itself is a really terrible leader on the UN Security Council because it thwarts any action against its client, Israel. So when you have major world states, like the members of the UN Security Council, using this forum to basically engage in the protection and the promotion of their pet projects, what kind of global governance is this? So I'm going to end with those remarks and see what happens next.
Thank you very much, Dr. And I'm going to now ask Dr. Simons to, give your perspective, Eastern European in particular. Thank you.
So, I will go about things a bit differently, a bit more critical of what we have currently, this geopolitical transformation, which is taking the world away from this Western-centric US unipolar world to a more non-Western-centric multipolar world. And whenever you have a transformation as this, there is inevitably conflict and competition because no hegemon wants to willingly give up its power and influence. And I mean, this region knows exactly this history when you have a declining hegemon in your region. So, I mean, I see crises, a whole lot of them, in different ones, and they're becoming increasingly interconnected. And they have not happened just in the last couple of years. These have been building. But I would ask the question, why are they building? What is the underlying condition which is driving this increasing competition and conflict around the world? And I'd say at the base of it, there is an increasing division between the Western and non-Western world. And this is based on the Western world becoming much more entrenched in a theoretical and an ideological worldview. And the non-Western world is engaged in what I'd more refer to as operational pragmatism. So that is to resolve things on a practical basis. And we can see this, for example, at the state of so-called liberal democracy. For example, if we look at liberal democracy, this is an absolute microcosm of this problem, because if we look at the word and the practice, these are quite differing. We have liberalism as an ideological function which is being promoted at the expense of democracy. And we can see this currently. I mean, we've seen it in the coronavirus pandemic. What were all those nice EU values about rule of law and individual human rights? They meant nothing. They're on paper, they're theoretical. But when push came to shove, the ideology and the theory won. And this is this idea what the West is trying to use to try and perpetuate its power and its system of hegemony. And this is what I'd call to create, they're using information as the fifth dimension of strategy. That is to create this idea of orthodoxy of knowledge. That is a one truth, if you like. And this one truth of the world, this is based on a form of coercion. I mean, India knows this well, considering the US pressure on its position on the Ukraine war as one expression. So you're having this coercion to create conformity, and conformity is used to create consensus. And consensus, the only problem with that, just because maybe everyone agrees that a certain thing is true or not, doesn't mean they're right. It just means everyone agrees on a certain point. And it's getting exposed even more. I mean, especially if we look at the state of ideology within the EU, where you have the so-called head of European Union diplomacy, when he started talking about the European garden as opposed to the jungle. I mean, I think I prefer to be in the jungle than the garden at the moment. This reminds me of a Turkish proverb. If you put a clown in the palace, it does not make him a king. It makes the palace a circus. And I mean, this is the state of things. And if we look at what's happening, I mean, this whole idea the world is against Russia about Ukraine. The Western world is against Russia on Ukraine for the reasons which I just outlined. And you're getting this pressure to conform. And if we're looking at these issues of application versus do what I say, not what I do, we can have a look at the basic premise of the US about Ukraine, because if we are to be blunt, Ukraine is the mechanism. It's not what the whole fight is about. The fight is much larger, and this is coming into shaping or trying to prevent this emerging new world order, which I do not think is a de-globalization, but rather a re-globalization. So this is where I'd contradict a number of the other speakers, because the idea is not to de-globalize, but to co-opt the globalization, because this is about power and influence, where geoeconomics feeds into geopolitics, and it supports the system. But I better leave here before I blow Nancy's timeline.
Again, it's very noticeable that amongst the three speakers we've had so far, there's been so much discussion about the language, the rhetoric, the narrative, the way we present the way things are. So how perspectives compete, impact how we even identify a crisis. So I'm going to ask our last two speakers to speak, and then I'm going to turn the moderating over to Dr. Tidemir so that we can continue the conversation. So Dr. Nagao, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, we need to talk about crisis. But if we face a crisis, wow, bad future will come. But that's not true, I think, because crisis can be the chances if we deal with properly. So currently, one of the most important crises is US-China competition. So which side is beneficial is the matter, I think, because winner side will get the benefit. So I need to analysis the US-China competition and which side will win. In the simply said, America is allowed to win the competition with China because of the three reasons. Firstly, America is still powerful. When we check the military expenditure, American military expenditure is 3 times bigger than China's. And when we check the equipment, Chinese submarine mainly is a conventional powered, but Americans were nuclear powered. And when, even if the GDP is the same, China try to catch up and maybe it will happen. But in this case, when we check the population, American population is 1/4 of China. So this means that when we compare the GDP per capita, Americans are 4 times bigger. So in this case, we can say America is powerful. And when we check the ally, this is very important. Number of ally is one of the important factors which side will win the competition. The last 3 competitions that has happened. World War I, winner side with 32 countries, loser side only 4. World War II, 54 countries was a winner, but loser are 8. And in US-Soviet Cold War, 54 versus 26. So now we need to check the 3D-based formal allies. America has 52 if we include Taiwan. In this case, India is a partner, not the 3D-based ally, but still America has 52. How many allies China has? Only 1, North Korea. So 52 versus 1. Obviously, America has the advantage. And when we check the history, yes, Americans say they have only the 246 years history, but if this is right, you can remember what happened 246 years ago. America is just one of the colony of the British Empire. We can see the only one superpower now. Their system is very effective to get the power, to win the competition. And when we check, all of the rival last 246 years has gone, including Germany, Japan, my country, and the Soviet Union. So we can say America is allowed to win the competition. So under such kind of situation, we should be the winner. Japan should be the winner. Of course, Bangladesh should be winner. For Bangladesh, what kind of benefit we can expect? For example, we need to focusing on the one word, friend sharing. Friend sharing, what is it? Simply said, the US side do not want to rely on Chinese market or China's supply chain, etc., so-called economic security. In this case, US side countries want to relocate their factories from China to other countries. If Bangladesh will be the main destination, when the US side country change their factories, relocate from China to, so in this case, Bangladesh can get the benefit. When the China suggests the Sonadia port project, Japan suggests the Matabari port project, and Bangladesh finally choose Matabari port project instead of Sonadia port project of China. That was a great decision. Bangladesh should continue such kind of decision. It will be the beneficial. It will be the winner in the US-China competition. That is what I want to say. And that is a good cause, I think. So Japan and Bangladesh will be the friend. In the US side, it's the best, I think. Thank you very much.
And I to ask former Ambassador Dr. Trigan Nayat to bring us to the first round, and then I'll hand over to the duties here.
Thank you, Chair. I must thank my friend Zillur Rahman for bringing me here after 32 years when I served in Bangladesh for the first time. Well, when we talk of the convergence of crisis, nearly everything has been said by my colleagues. So let me just expostulate a few things that will or are being reflected in each of our countries and globally as well. When the pandemic came here, we may call it man-made, we may call it natural, but when the pandemic came, certain things were very clear. That it had a debilitating impact on every nation. It is continuing to have it even today. It has exposed the vulnerabilities. So what we all have to really address, whether we want it or not, which I put as 4H. H stands for hunger. A lot of countries are suffering from that. H stands for habitat. We're talking of climate change, and the COP27 perhaps was a wasted exercise. We might see the COP28 being the same. Because what happens is when the biggest polluter or the biggest power under a president decides to walk out of the Paris Agreement, does not even agree, then you can imagine what would the others do. So that is the kind of situation. And then we have to see health, H. That is our major concern. When we talk of SDGs, nearly all our problems are combined in that. But the SDGs have taken a backseat. Nobody is, except in conferences, nobody is bothered about it. Because you're bothered about immediate problems that we are facing. And lastly, we'll have to talk about technology, H, high tech. We have to move into the world, whether we want it or not, is moving towards autonomous lives. It is the AI-driven Industrial Revolution 4.0, in which I'm sure our countries do not want to be left behind. And then comes, on the back of it, now you can say whether pandemic was preventable. Yes, indeed it was. And we know a country kept a lot of information to it, did not share in time, did not happen. We also see in the climate and the pandemic something called vaccine apartheid, or for that matter, green apartheid. And that's very much prevalent on a day-to-day basis. And these are the situations that we have to confront as developing countries and as developed countries, because it's a common problem. In one of the panels I was listening to, they said, well, Bill Gates told them that, the developing countries need not do this or that. It is a common problem of the world. It's a universal problem. It cannot be that I sit back and say that I am not going to undertake my responsibility and I'll just palm it off onto others. It's a common cause. So that's where it is extremely important to agree to that. Then comes your Russia-Ukraine war. Was it preventable? Yes, indeed, it was. It could have been. It can stop today. American ambassador today said that if Russia stops today. I say if the Americans want to stop it, it can stop today. It's possible. The wars don't happen just like that. We have to learn to live together, find a modus vivendi. Unfortunately, that is not happening. And what is happening is we are faced with the 3F catastrophe: fuel, food, and fertilizers. Countries with large populations, and the area where we are sitting here, India, 1.4 billion people. Bangladesh, 800 million people, constitute more than 1/7 of the world. Include China, it becomes nearly 2/3. Now, those are countries which are suffering and will continue to suffer. What do we do in such a situation? We see that now President Xi Jinping has come back, was coronated third time. Earlier, everybody thought, even I believed, that China doesn't want a war. Sun Tzu philosophy, win a war without fighting it. Now what did he say? He called his PLA and he said, you should be war ready. Fight a war and win it. Wolf warrior diplomacy we are watching everywhere. Most of the countries have suffered from it. United States, on the other hand, is seeing that it has in China a competitor which might replace it from numero uno position, technologically, economically or otherwise. China wants a breather for 10, 20 years to be able to compete there and be on the top of it. Do they want to give it? I don't see. So the way we saw the Eurasian war which is happening, and another point before I forget. Today I listened very carefully to my friend, American Ambassador Peter Haas. He spoke about many of these things, but perhaps one omission was terrorism. Isn't it an existential problem for the world? And how did it come into being? Invasion of Iraq, invasion of Libya. You cannot forget and you can't take issue by issue only for deciding your policy choices. And then when a country like India says that we fight for peace, we fight for dialogue, we stand for diplomacy, we stand for the United Nations Charter, it is laughed at, scoffed at. So what we are looking at is, in my view, unfortunately what is happening is that whatever be the consequence of this war, it stops today, it doesn't stop, it becomes a frozen conflict. We are looking at Cold War 2.0 with a much worse implementation mechanisms, because what we have seen in this war, we have seen nowhere, never. We have seen unilateral sanctions that we don't recognize, but all of us are impacted by them. What we are seeing today is the weaponization of financial instruments. A French member of Parliament was here in Delhi the other day. He was talking and he said, we are worried that a country's foreign exchange reserves are not made available to it. We think that tomorrow, if we are not on the same side, then we will also face the same music. That means erosion of trust in the liberal order, in the financial institutions, and that is a dangerous precedent, because we all look up to those liberal principles and want to live by them. So when we talk of climate justice or social justice or anything like that, they are mere talks. Nobody means them. So we have to be practical. We have to look at the possibilities in an objective manner while making policy choices. So when I see the Cold War 2.0, in which on the one side we will have some, of course, transatlantic alliance itself is seeing somewhat of a break. But yesterday at the APEC summit, the Macron, President of France, maybe it was in the context of the submarine deal, but he said very clearly, we don't believe in hegemony. We don't believe in confrontation. We believe in stability. We are in the jungle and we have two big elephants trying to become more and more nervous. If they become very nervous and they start a war, it will be a big problem for the rest of the jungle. You need cooperation of a lot of other animals, tigers, monkeys and so on. So this is the jungle Raj that we are looking at. And this will be a much worse kind of situation. What do countries like India do in that? I believe, I may be totally wrong, time has come for a very large number of countries to look at whether being on one side or the other helps you, or be a part of the strategic autonomy and leverage your strengths strategically. Thank you.
We have run out of time on our schedule, but if you all would like to maybe comment for a few final minutes, and I'm going to hand over the reins to you. But I don't want to keep you from your tea and coffee. These were really powerful statements from all of you, and I really greatly appreciate it. So what do you think? You want to maybe take a few more minutes and maybe have a little bit of a question or comment to each other. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nancy. So I was not really prepared to do this anyway. So what we would do in this round, and we would really adhere to time, because some people have taken 5 minutes, 10 minutes, will not do it. So it's 1 minute, meaning 1 minute. So as we are looking at the title of the session, so there are convergence, and you are talking about contested convergence or conditional convergence or divergences. So let's really have a pinpointed 1 or 2 or 5 sentences, but not crossing more than 1 minute. I would really like to hear your views or challenge whatever you have heard from others. So I'll start from the left, so my Japanese colleague.
I'm sorry, sir. I need to remember what should I do.
No, you can comment on the
Okay.
panelists as well.
Yeah, of course, I run roads from you. And in this case, many variety of the crisis each speaker pointed out. So that's why which crisis is the most important if you choose which one is my question. And I have already choose U.S.-China competition, but what is your answer? Is I want to hear for the world or for the Bangladesh.
Okay, next.
I don't have anything further to add.
Okay. Ambassador?
Well, the only thing I can say is that how do we work together? So I would say at one time we used to have Panchshila principles. Now I would say there are 5 S. First S is Samman, respect for one another. Second is Sambad, have a dialogue. Sahyog, cooperation. Shanti is for peace and is needed for Samriddhi, that is prosperity.
Thank you. Great.
Okay, just a few points that everyone is talking about this rules-based order, as it is called now. But if we go back 10 years, it did not refer to itself as the rules-based order. It referred to itself as an order based on international law. And this is an interesting distinction because a rule is not necessarily law. And we can see this playing out today. And I'd say that a number of these crises which are being faced at the moment are home goals. The food crisis, energy crisis, inflation, etc. I mean, if we look at the food crisis, while they're having a shortage of food, I mean, you got Western governments closing down farms, imposing taxes, decreasing food production. It does not go together. Energy crisis, well, the same thing here. You've got this ideology which was for green energy but not creating energy that would replace nuclear power or other power sources, and also sanctions against Russia even before the war began. These are all decreasing energy sources at a time of energy crisis. So you can see here that these things are also inflated by, I would say, unwise government policy based on ideology rather than pragmatism.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a fantastic panel. We could at least say that there were pluralism in perspectives. So we upheld the proverbial phrase, which is unity in diversity. And definitely there are certain issues that really came in the course of discussion. One is that we have to really challenge, question and ask, how do we really frame our discussion in terms of realism of various shades, or idealism of various shades, or liberalism of various shades? Because that really leads to how we perceive the world and how we analyze different contexts. So from deglobalization to an idea of a contested globalization to that of now WEF providing a chair to the Chinese president to open the World Economic Forum to many ideas, and so that's fantastic in the sense that we listen to how do we shape our perspective and build our scenarios in terms of understanding it. Secondly, what we see that there are certain operational issues that has not been addressed, and there are hardly that kind of a statesmanship. Rather, what we have witnessed is a kind of a brinkmanship, and that are sliding to certain degree of tipping points in terms of climate change, in terms of food, in terms of health emergencies, as has been said. And third point, which is also quite important, is to really understand that there is a kind of we live in an uncertain and unequal world where there are degree of differences, and the recovery path is not that of a VI, but rather it is taking of a K shape. So we have to engage ourselves in terms of understanding why this has happened. And the last point, which is quite important, when there are inequalities between the countries, there are also inequalities in terms of within the countries. So what we need is really have a perspective in a state of really looking at it and trying to justify it rather to do the reasoning of it. So that's quite important, and that has really given us, I would finish with a ray of hope that at least we see in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is, if you translate, I am not good at Arabic, but what it means is basically the Bay of Wise. So what we had there is a kind of certain movements, but this has not really provided us a livable earth. But what really strikes us and really allows us to move forward is the way the younger generation has come on it, and really making their headways and trying to really make sure that the statesmen, the politicians listen to them. And that's the ray of hope, that with that kind of a hope we would complete this session. Thank you for being with us, and it was really an excellent session. In terms of myself, I have really benefited out of the perspectives that we heard, and it was really, we couldn't give them enough time. We are sorry for that, but definitely we would study their articles and we would benefit out of that process. Thank you once again. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I would like to request our speakers to come in front of the stage for the official photo session. There is arrangement for tea and coffee in the ballroom foyer, and everyone is requested to join us there. Thank you.